you, Georgine, and I appreciate the DC Slovox for inviting me to do this presentation, and I thank everyone that's joined us today. So I'm going to switch to my first slide, which are my influencers. I'm going to use a term that we have now. There's many influencers out in the world, and here are mine. So those people that taught me all those things that Georgine mentioned are on this slide. The first ones are my great-grandparents, Michael and Mary Gido. They came from Topolan and migrated to the United States in the late 1800s and went to Sheffield, PA, where my great-grandfather got a job in a tannery. And they lived in a little two-room house called a shanty, and it was on Shanty Street. And my great-grandmother took in boarders, and those boarders and the kids, they slept up in the attic. And the one thing I remember my grandfather telling me is that attic, you could see through the slats in the roof. And in the wintertime, icicles grew on the nails that came through that roof. And I can't imagine how cold it was. But after a time, my grandfather became sick when he worked in the tannery due to all the fumes, and they returned to Topolan for a while. And they were there, but after he felt better and everything went well, he came back home. He went back to the tannery, eventually moving up to Erie, but unfortunately, he ended up dying young at the age of 40 from cancer, more than likely from working in the tannery and being exposed to all those fumes. But luckily, my great-grandmother lived a long life, and she didn't pass away until I was 2 years old. The next one are George and Mary McDinnis. Now, I don't know the exact villages they came from, but I know my grandmother's family came from a small, what part of the family came from a small town outside of Mukachevo, which is now in Hungary, but it used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I do know that they're from there, but I cannot find the name of it. And I do not know where my great-grandfather George came from. But when they immigrated to the Tarentum-Brackenridge area, which is about 25 miles outside of Pittsburgh. And George worked in the mill, and Mary ran a shop right off the railroad tracks at one of the railroad stops. And it was one of those old-fashioned shops with go in, you could buy anything, or you could get a snack from getting off the railroad. Now, luckily, I had them until I was about 7 years old, so we got to know them a little bit. And then on the wedding picture are both sets of my grandparents. You have John and Mary Gido, who were born here in the United States. John up in Erie, my grandfather up in Erie, my grandmother down in Brackenridge. And they met when my grandfather went down to Brackenridge for work. And of course, the church and social clubs played a big part in meeting people. And that's where he met my grandmother. And they eventually got married and moved up to Erie, where they had my dad, Father John. Then my Bubba and Didi Keslak, they both came from Olszewice, but my grandmother was actually born in Pennsylvania. And I didn't find that out until about 10 years ago. And as an infant, her and her family returned to Olszewice, and she grew up there. And as a teenager, came to this country. So my grandfather, Andrew, came and immigrated to Johnstown. And he started working in the mill, but he also farmed, and he also did construction work. And my Bubba came later on, and she married my grandfather, and they had 9 kids. So they had a long life. So these are my influencers, and they're the people that started me off on my trek down the fiber arts path. So what I'm going to do is just out of my own personal connection here. This is St. Michael's Church in Olszewice. My second great grandfather was a cantor there, and he's actually buried in that churchyard. And that is one of my cousins, Mr. Belichak. Now, I don't know how many cousins removed he is, but he's one of my cousins. And one of my cousins sent that photograph to me. And the other church is in Topolan, which is where my father's family come from. So there are my 2 churches from the 2 villages we come from. So now we're going to start talking about the fiber. You cannot spin or weave or make lace without the fiber behind them. And typically in Eastern Europe, it would be flax or hemp or wool. The first we're going to talk about is flax and hemp. Flax and hemp are basically the same type of fiber. They are both bast plant fibers, meaning that the fiber is collected from the inner bark of the plant. The flax and hemp properties are so similar that if you get them in fiber form, you really have to look very closely at them to try to figure out which one's flax and which one's hemp. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about hemp because, and then it will pretty much reflect on flax moving forward, because the process to harvest them and produce the fibers to use are the same. So hemp fiber is more coarse, has longer, less flexible internal fibers than flax does, and it can grow up to 16 feet, which is a lot taller than flax. Flax usually only grows 2 to 3 feet. So because it grows so tall, you can usually get a longer fiber, more about 5 to 6 feet out of the hemp plant versus the flax plant. Hemp is believed to have originated in Central Asia and then was recorded in China around 2800 BC, and finally into the Mediterranean countries of Europe early in the Christian era, finally spreading to the rest of Europe during the Middle Ages, which was around 1300 to 1500. So that's when it would have come into Eastern Europe. So now we're just going to move forward and talk mostly about flax and how flax is processed, keeping in mind in the back of your head that hemp would have been processed in the same way. So flax was first sourced from wild plants, and it is believed to be one of the oldest natural fibers used by humans when they transitioned from being a nomadic hunting and gathering people to an agricultural lifestyle. The earliest evidence we have found to date, and this changes all the time, as you know, archaeology is always finding something new, is it traces back the wild flax to the upper Paleolithic era, which is about 30,000 years ago. And the evidence was found in a cave in the Republic of Georgia where they actually found spun, knotted, and dyed flax fibers. So this is where the oldest fiber at this time, and it was a wild flax, not a domestic flax. The domestic flax is developed by the Mesopotamians in the Fertile Crescent approximately 9,000 years ago. And I have an image up of the screen on the Fertile Crescent. And now you can see where it gets its name. It goes from Lower Egypt up to Assyria and then down. So it's actually in a crescent shape. And this is where they first settled in agricultural communities and started to produce flax, which was cultivated for its oil seeds as opposed to the fiber. So the cultivation of flax for fiber came much later. From the Middle East, it transitioned into Syria and Turkey about 9,000 years ago, and then into Switzerland and Germany and China and India, maybe 5,000 years ago. And then we have Iron Age findings showing that there was a perennial flax grown across Europe by the people of what's present day France and Belgium, the Gauls and the Celts, who were the earliest flax growers in Western Europe. And they learned about flax through the Romans. Now, it is believed that the Slavic tribes were the first to begin cultivating flax in Eastern Europe, and that they received the flax education from the Greeks. Now, how do we know where flax is found? It's from archaeological finds that identify what flax fiber production was happening. Some of the things that identify where these come from are the tools, maybe remnants of finished products and waste products. So we're talking the spindles, the whorls that are on the spindles, maybe seeds or leftover plant fabrics, the stems or roots. So there's a lot of things that can let archaeologists tell us where these plants and things come from. So now we're going to talk about how we cultivate the flax product, flax itself. So in the modern world, when we go past a field, we see these huge, massive machines that are preparing the ground to be seeded, and then we see them planting the seeds, and we see them literally harvesting it for it. So everything today is industrial. Now put yourself back into the 18th century. We'll just go back to the 18th century. And you're barefoot and you're walking in the fields and you have to use your bare hands with the tools you have, or if you're lucky, you have a farm animal to help you. And the first thing you'd have to do is clear the field of all the debris, plant life, weeds that are there. Then you'd have to prepare the ground to reseed the seeds. And to sow the seeds, and we're talking about flax seeds at this point, what you want to do is you want to sow them densely, because the best thing you could do is have it grow densely, because that eliminates you having to go and weed the flax field. So the denser you can seed the ground, the less room weeds have to grow up. So on the left here, you see flax growing and it's nice and green, and it hasn't got to the stage where the purple flowers are. Once they've seeded the ground, it takes about 100 days for the flax plant to mature. And in ancient Egypt, what they would do is they would do 3 harvests. They would get a green plant that just started to flower, and the flowers are just slowly starting to die off, and they'd harvest some of it. And this would produce a very fine, very soft fiber. And then they'd wait a little longer when all of the flowers were gone, but it's still a green plant. And this would be a medium soft and a medium strong fiber, or they'd wait until it's completely brown to harvest it. Now, for the most time in Eastern Europe, they waited the full 100 days until the plant was ready to harvest. The flowers were mostly gone and the bolls or the seed pods were on there. So on the left, we have a new field growing. On the right, we have a field that's ready to be harvested. So when you harvest it, and I found this interesting when I was doing my research on flax, because I find it very difficult to spin flax, but I got a few hints from my family on how to do that. So when you harvest it, they're going out to the fields, and this was backbreaking work. They would literally have to bend over, grab it by the roots and pull it out. So on the right, you see the from Medieval News. I found a picture that actually shows the roots. You pull it from the roots because you want the longest fiber possible from the flax plant. If you cut it, you're losing inches of flax, and you don't want to do that. So they pull it out by the roots and they bundle it up and they stack it in the fields to let it dry. And they let it dry for a couple of weeks so that it's ready to harvest the seeds. So they're harvesting the seeds, and that's called rippling. This is a rippling comb, and this is on the right. You see that you take a bundle of flax, you pull it through, and you literally are scraping off the seeds. Now, they needed to get the seeds off the plants because they need it for the next year's harvest. They're already preparing for the following year. Plus, they also use the seeds for oil. And it's linseed oil, and it can be used for many different things, which we'll talk about. The next thing they have to do is to ret the flax. Retting causes the outer layer or the shaft of the flax to rot. And you do this so that you can get to the bast fibers that are on the inside. And there's 2 ways that you can ret flax. One is to put it in a running stream or a pond or a trough. Now, the running stream is really nice because it keeps it nice and fresh. Pond and trough, it's great because it allows it to rot a little bit faster, but the detriment to that is the stench. The stench of rotting flax is not pleasant. And so that's the detriment of using a pond or a trough. The other way is called dew retting. And that's when you lay your flax out in the field and you let the ambient moisture in the ground and in the dew or in the air start to do that deterioration process for you. And once it's done retting, which takes a couple weeks, you have to dry it again. So you pick it up, you stack it up, and this time you try to put it somewhere where it's not going to get rained on or wet because it needs to be dry, and it takes about 2-3 weeks to completely dry it. So next we have scutching. Now, I've had difficulty finding a lot of scutching pictures or retting pictures, so I'm using what I could find. And on the left, you see what we call breaks. They're these little wood beading apparatuses. So you lift up a handle, you put your flax in, and you beat and you draw the flax through. And what this does is it breaks up the chaff or the outer stalk of the flax plant so that you can start getting to the bast fibers that you need. And once you have done the scutching, you now have to hit it with a wooden knife, or what looks like a wooden knife. And you literally are chopping at it so that you break off those fibers and you collect them on the ground. And that's the good thing. I'll tell you later about flax. You use every piece of the flax. Nothing is wasted. So on these pictures, the left, you have the scutching or the breaks, and in the right photograph, you have the breaks and the two breaks, but you also have a sitting distaff and a hand spindle that is starting to be spun. So after they dry, the final process is called hackling. And when you're hackling, what you're doing is you're taking the clean fibers that you just got the outside sheath off of, and you're pulling it through the combs. And what you're doing is you're straightening those fibers, and you're getting rid of the rest of the small fibers that are called tow, or any other chaff that's left on the flax. And once you have done that several times, you end up, oh, sorry, I forgot this slide was in there. This is an engraving that I saw, and it's actually a flax processing plant. And you can see the metal tines of where they're pulling the flax through, and also the fabric where they're catching the debris from the flax. And I thought it was rather cool because you could see that they were in skirts and scarves and what they looked like back in the 1883 rather. So here's your final product. This is what flax looks like when it's been through the process and now it's ready to spin. We're not going to talk about spinning yet, because the next thing we'd like to talk about with you is wool, and how wool and sheep herding came into the Slovak Republic. I'm not going to go back to the history of wool, because every culture has wool, has sheep or goats. So every culture had it, and it's just too much to go into. So I'm going to talk about how sheep herding came into the Slovak Republic. And this sheep herding came in when Romanian shepherd migrants called the Vlachs advanced along the Carpathian mountain range during the 17th century, 14th through 17th century. And the Wallachian settlers came around the 15th century and settled in central Slovakia, primarily to do sheep herding. And the mountain meadows, if anybody's been to Slovakia, they're very high up and they're rocky, and they're not conducive to growing a lot of different plants or produce, and they're not very conducive to herding other farm animals up there. However, they're very perfect for sheep herding or goat herding. So a traditional sheep herding farm would consist of a wooden hut called a kolaba and an enclosure where the sheep spent the night. The farm was run by a herdsman, which I believe is called a bacha, and he also had helpers. And they lived on this farm from the spring until the fall. And they herded the sheep, they lambed the sheep, they had to shear the sheep, they had to milk the sheep, they had to clean their hooves, they had to store the fleece that they took off of them, they had to make milk. When they got the milk from them, they had to make the cheese, they had to make the brinza and the other products that they needed. But the other thing that they had to do is, because they were up there and isolated, they had to create everything they used. So they had to create the molds for the cheese, they had to create the buckets to get the milk, they had to build their fences for the sheep, and they were pretty much isolated until they came away in the fall and brought the sheep back down to the villages for the winter time. And at that time, they would also bring all of the wool and the cheese and the other products that they harvested from the sheep. Now you could recognize the sheep herders as well, because they had big belts and heavy wool coats, and they had embellished bags. But they also used the furaya, I never can say that, fiara, which is the pipe, And they also had bagpipes. So you could always recognize a sheep herder. So right now in Slovakia, there's 4 main Slovak sheep breeds: the domestic Sigaya, the Slovenska Merenka, the Povodna Valaška, and the Zalaška, the I can't say the last one, I'm sorry, the improved Wallachian sheep. And each sheep is a little bit different, and they're used pretty much for their meat, their milk, and their soft wool, or their wool, but every sheep has a different texture and use for their wool. The Sigai, the domestic Sigai, has a very soft wool, so it can be used to spin and make clothing out of, and it's also used for its meat and milk. The merino sheep is also has a soft fleece to it and can be spun, and is also used for its meat and its milk. However, when you get to the Wallachian sheep, they are rather small herd, so they're not very big, and they don't produce a lot of milk. And their fleece is a mixture of fibers, and that causes huge variations in the crimp and the staple of the fiber, which would impact how it spins. So it's not a very fine fiber, it's a very coarse fiber. So it's the original sheep, but they're not bred as much as the others in the country. But they do have what they call an improved Wallachian sheep. And I'm trying to do research on that because I'm not exactly sure what the improvement is. And I don't know if it's a larger animal, or that they're producing more milk, or their fiber is better. But those are the 4 breeds of sheep that are most common in the Slovak Republic at this time. And shearing the sheep, is rather interesting, because now we have electric shears. They didn't have electric shears back then. This is a pair of sheep shears that I was talking to a friend of mine, told him I was going to do this presentation. He goes, "Oh, I have my grandfather's sheep shears." So he loaned them to me, and I took a photograph of them. So this is a pair of sheep shears that would have been used to cut sheep. And I found a couple pictures of sheep being cut, and they're literally using a pair of scissors to cut the wool off the sheep. I cannot imagine having a sheep sit still that long, or trying to cut a whole fleece off of a sheep with a pair of scissors, but this is how they were doing it. And you can see in both pictures, the sheep are just sitting there calmly waiting for it to be sheared. So every sheep herder needs a good sheepdog, and the Slovak Kuvac, or the Slovenski Kuvac, is the sheepdog that they used. And it is a very loyal, very hardy, very faithful and dog, and it's fearless. And it had to be fearless because it needed to protect these sheep from the bears and the wolves and any other wild animals that were out there that would come to attack the herd. Now, the one thing about the Kuvac, and the main thing that you can see, is they're white. They're all white, and that is standard for the breed. And they had to be white because they needed to be able to be seen at night. You didn't want to mistake your dog for the wolf or the bear. So they're purposely bred to be white so that they could be seen at night. If they were protecting the herd, you knew they were there. So now we have our flax, our wool, and here's a picture of, I believe these are goats being milked. So this is how they would milk, and you see the milk bucket. And there's the pen for the sheep. So now we're coming into spinning. And when I was in Europe at the University of Bratislava, they gave me this ethnographic atlas. And it's been a wonderful tool for me because I can find things in there and learn the names of the tools that I use for spinning. And the origins in spinning fiber is lost. We don't know where spinning came from, but archaeological evidence shows that there were string skirts as far back as 20,000 years ago. And the process of spinning seems to have started by people taking little tufts of fiber from sheep or other animals and just twisting them along their legs to form a twine or a thread or a yarn, and adding to it until they got the length. And the first spinning tool that they have found is a rock. They would tie that spun thread around the rock, and they would spin it and add more wool and add the spin like a drop spindle, but not a drop spindle. It was just a rock with a thread wrapped around it. And as they would lengthen it, they would wrap it around the rock, drop the rock again, spin some more, do that. So from that method, the next method that seems to have come around was spinning with a spindle, but this spindle was just a straight stick, no whirl, nothing on it. It was just a stick roughly 12 inches long, on which after they would twist it, they would wrap it around the stick. And what they sort of found out through trial and error is that when you had wool on the stick, it spun better. So then the next thing they did was add a whirl, and a whirl is a circular disc of stone at this time that was added to the bottom of the spindle so that it twisted the spindle better. Then the use of the distaff came in to hold the fibers. And in this picture, you can see the distaff just behind the crib, and she is holding a hand spindle, not a drop spindle. Most everybody is familiar with the drop spindle, which has the little hook on the top, and you twist it, you drop it, and you draft your fibers with one hand, and the drop spindle puts the twist in, you wrap it around the drop spindle, you do it again. With Eastern Europeans, they hold the spindle in their hand, and they're literally putting the twist in their hands, and then they wrap it and they draft and wrap. They don't drop the spindle. And you'll see, and the reason I chose some of these is you're also going to see the elaborate embroidery and the fibers that they're using. So these are not their everyday clothes. These are their special clothes, but these are posed photographs. So I chose them because of that, because you're seeing the embroidery on the shirts, you're seeing the embellishment on the vest she's wearing, or on her sleeves, or on her skirt, and in her hair. Plus, you'll see them in the pictures in the background as well. So now we have another one, and you'll see that once again, you have lace on the skirts, you have embroidery on the sleeves and the aprons, you have embroidery on the men's vest. So everything is highly decorative, and now their creativity is coming in. But once again, this one is showing a drop spindle as opposed to a hand spindle. It looks dropped. Now, I don't know if that was for the pose or if she actually does use it as a drop spindle. Spindle and distaff remained in house use in households until about the 19th century and beyond, mainly because of the simplicity. So here we have a little bit of an older picture in the top, but once again, she's dressed up. This was a photograph taken on purpose, so she's dressed in her croy, and it's highly decorated. Her scarf is decorated, her sleeves are decorated, but she is using a hand spindle. And then we have our Bubbas, and we have a left-handed one, which I haven't seen, so I included her. And I think she's utterly adorable, and she's spinning her wool using the hand spindle. And on the other photograph, we have another one spinning flax. Now, the difference between spinning in wool and flax is you can spin wool dry, because wool fiber has teeth, and those teeth will hold on to each other, and it works very well. With the bast fibers, they're smooth. It's like hair. But it doesn't have those little scales that you can lock onto, so you have to spin it wet. And a thing that I learned from my grandfather, and this is where my great-grandmother Mary comes in. When he was back in Europe, they would walk to and from the fields barefoot, but all the Bubbas would have this belt on their waist, and they would put the top of their distaff. You see how they're holding it, the Bubba on the right is holding it under arm, and the woman up in the left-hand corner, my left-hand corner, is holding it under her arm. They actually have it stuck in a belt or a loop in their belt, and they can walk. They used to walk. My great-grandmother and her compatriots would walk down to the field to work. And while they walked to the field, they would be spinning and singing. And then they'd go and work in the field. And on the way back from the field, they'd spin while walking again, which I've tried and I've tripped several times. So it's not my forte to walk and spin at the same time. But I found that that was an interesting story. The other thing that helped me, and this just totally stunned me, I was trying to learn how to spin flax, and it was breaking. And I'm using this mixture that I was told to use. And my grandfather said, hold on a minute. And he went to the neighbor's tree and brought in bitter apples. And he said, chew the bitter apple and start spinning on your flax. And I did. And it held together beautifully. And what I've found elsewhere too in my reading is they used to chew dried plums to do the same thing, to get that spit, to be able to spit on the flax, to hold it together and act like the glue. So in the 13th century, a new invention came. Oh, I included the picture from Michaelotza because I'm enthralled with the distaff. My family came from Topolan, which is now the street in Michaelotza. So this enthralled me because I'm sort of looking at that and saying, wow, I wonder if I could make a distaff for myself that looks like that. So we'll go to the next slide, because now we have the introduction of a spinning wheel in about the 13th to the 14th century. They think that the spinning wheel originated in India around 500 to 1000, the year 500 to 1000, but it's not 100% sure, but it came into Eastern Europe approximately 13th and 14th century. So this made a big impact on the women now, because before they were spinning and weaving all year round. They would spin going to the fields. They would spin throughout the winter while the men wove just to produce enough fiber. Now, you're expected to, as a young girl, to fill your hope chest. You have to have all the linens for your house. You have to have, look at that pile of pillows back there. You got to weave enough fabric and have enough fiber to make all that stuff and have your chest ready by the time you were 16 or 17 years old. So it was very important, and it was it impacted them tremendously, because now they could spin a lot faster. They still use their sitting distaffs or their standing distaffs, but now if they were lucky, they had a spinning wheel. And usually they were homemade, that the men of the family would see one and they'd say, yeah, I can make that for you. And they'd make it. So we have the sitting distaff being used in this photograph along with her spinning wheel. And that made a big impact on the ease of their life. So right now we've gone through the production and the spinning of the fibers. So now we have the fibers. Now, what do you do with those fibers? So pretty much with the flax, you've now made a linen thread, and now you're going to start weaving your linen fabric, or you're going to spin your wool thread or yarn, and you're going to weave that as well. And I was amazed when my grandfather told me, especially after learning about the Wallachian sheep, which is probably what they were growing, that he had to wear wool underwear. And that to me was outrageous. And I asked him, didn't it hurt? And he said, yeah, it was very irritating, but you got used to it. So they were wearing wool underwear from the sheep. But the standard loom that they had was just a 2-harness loom. And they either had to pull the harness up with a cord, or they had to push down on a pedal for it to pop up. So these are some, and I chose these pictures because you can also see some of the fabrics in the house, the rugs on the floor, the linens on the bed. The weaving is normally done with just 2 harnesses, which means you're making cloth. How did they get those patterns in this cloth? And you do not see it on these photographs. But I'm showing you these because I want you to see how they used color, how they put it into their lives, and how they wore this on special occasions. So how they put their color into the cloth, and this you can see right at the bottom, this is also a loom. And it took me a while to find out what kind of loom this was. This is the loom that they use to make those cuffs that they wear. And I didn't know that. So I'm not quite sure how they actually weave the color in there, but that is a loom that they make the cuffs that they wear. And that's more research that I have to do. So when you start to weave, you have to make your warp. And here we have, on the left, we have a warping stand where they have put their spindles of thread. And in the background, you actually have the warping board. It's not like any warping board that I've used here. It's actually in a circle. And in the lower right, I included that because they also have a stick that they've put the fibers through that help them keep the fibers from being untangled. So they're actually creating their warp. And once you do the warp, there's different ways you can warp a loom. You can either go from front to back or back to front. And it's by a person's preference. I've seen people doing it both ways in Europe. So it's by your own preference, but usually we go from front to back because they are wrapping the wool completely on this big drum at the back, because when they do it, they do a big ball of it so that they don't have to rewarp the loom for quite some time. So this is the Help of Folk Festival, and I've included this in here because of the beautiful colors, the beautiful embroideries, beautiful weavings. And keeping in mind that these people, most of them only have a 2-harness loom, how do they get those colors in there? They do what we call pickup. We have pickup sticks. And it's not like the game you played when you were a kid. This is literally a stick that can be up to the width of your loom. And you go through and you pick up fibers and you literally create the shaft to throw your shuttle through with your color. And then you take the stick out and then you throw your weft thread again, a clear weft thread, and then you pick it up again and throw your color thread, and then another clear, white weft thread through if that's your color of your weft. And you do that for every single row, changing every single row to create those patterns. And I'm just going to keep going through here. You can see a bobbin lace pillow. You can see they've embroidered their hats. They've made the cuffs decorative for the bottom of their slacks. They have window decorations. So this is all their imagination coming through. They're working hard in the fields. They're creating this plain fabric. They're going to decorate it. They're going to make it fun for special days, for weddings, for special occasions, for their Sunday best. And they're making their houses look beautiful. And some of the patterns they have, they're all in their head, or they create them as they go. And of course, mothers will pass down to their daughters specific patterns that they've developed. But from talking to a lot of people, they don't have patterns. They just do the pattern, and it comes from themselves, which I just find fascinating. And here's a rug loom. We included a rug loom for everybody so people can see what the rugs look like. And look at the heft on the beater bar on the rug loom on the right. That is a pretty hefty bar, but it creates a very tight, very strong carpet. And this is in a museum, and it shows the 2 treadles and the 2 harnesses and a traditional type of loom that would have been in a standard household. And we have a woman here actually putting just rosa color. And if you're doing rosa color without the fancy patterns, you can just go back and forth and you weave traditionally like you would weave any normal fiber, as long as you're just changing the color every row. It's when you have to do a pattern when it becomes complicated and you have to use the pickup stick. Now in here, I have a 4-harness loom. I can do tie-ups on that loom that allows me to change how my harnesses are picked up. And if I wanted to, I could buy 4 more harnesses because I have a baby wolf, which can go up to 8 harnesses. I can do up to 8 tie-ups on this, and it allows me to create these patterns much easier. But when I demonstrate, I actually demonstrate using the pickup method. So this lady, I love this lady. She was born in 1942, and she is working on a loom that her father made for her mother. So that loom is 100 years old, and her father made it. And look at the pattern she's putting into the fabric that she's making. So I just wanted to include that in there because she learned from her mother, and she continues to do difficult patterns, but she can weave 12 inches per hour on her patterns. And this one is also a interesting loom because of the size and the heft of that beater. And you built up muscles when you were working on these looms. Now, my sister-in-law, Tammy, and my brother were just in Prague. Their daughter is going to the university in Prague. And she was walking down the street and she took this photo. And I loved it because you have a man, and this is a handmade loom with a big barrel. You can actually see the big barrel on the end. And he's sitting in the middle of the street weaving and selling his wares in August. and I want to buy that orange scarf that's right in the front. So the next thing we're going to talk about is bobbin lacemaking, and it's called Polichkovani. Bobbin lacemaking has been around for a long time, but the exact origin of bobbin lacemaking is unknown. From sumptuary laws, from paintings, from household records is where we start seeing the first records of bobbin lace. And bobbin lace is traced back to Italy. And that is the first sighting of it so far. And nothing as of yet has shown it coming from anywhere else. So bobbin lace has migrated throughout Europe. And you can see, if you look at the history, you'll see it migrating through the different countries of Europe. And it came into the Slovak Republic a couple different ways. And these are the regions of bobbin lace in Slovakia. Now, bobbin lace didn't just pop up. It actually came in through migrant workers that were coming into different areas to do mining. So the Germans had the skill set to do minings, and they were being brought into the Slovak Republic in order to work in the mines. And they brought their wives with them, and those wives made bobbin lace, and they taught the local women in these different areas where they came into. So a lot of the places had these people come in and start making lace. And one of the other places, Solnabana, there's a little bit different idea. There's two ways or thoughts of how this came in Solnabana, which is, it's called salt mine lace there. And it was in near Prešov. There's a little town outside of Prešov where it started. And they have two thoughts on this. One was the Empress Maria brought in Belgian lace makers to teach the women of the village, because the mines flooded and the men were dead, how to make bobbin lace so that they can earn an income to support their families. So that's one way. The other one was that there was a wealthy family there that wanted a fancy dress for their daughter's wedding, and they brought lace makers in to teach the women of the village to make the lace for their daughter's wedding. So we have three things happening. We have German miners coming in that are bringing their wives who teach the women how to make the lace. We have Maria Theresa bringing Belgian lace makers in to train the miners' wives after they lost their husband. Or we have also the wealthy land owner who brought the lace in for the wedding. So I usually use a small roller pillow with a flat base to hold my bobbins. I did not learn when I was making lace how to hold my bobbins in my hands. These are the typical bolster pillows, but the bolster pillows were much larger than this. But these are typical bolster pillows, and you notice the bobbins have very thick staffs. Now, bobbins are used just to hold the thread. They're there as a tool so that you can cross and twist the threads in order to make the lace. Now, literally, bobbin lace is made by crossing left to right one thread and right to left the other thread, which is a cross and twist. And by moving the bobbins those two ways, you can make a variety of different patterns. Now, there's a couple places that make lace in the country where the women don't have a pattern. They make lace without a pattern. They have the pattern in their head. They use pins, but no pattern. I use a pattern. I'm not good. These women just amaze me that can do that. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures of the different styles of lace. And you can see this one has a pin pricking in the background, which is what I do. You take a piece of cardstock, you transfer your pattern by pricking the holes. And sometime if you're using a heavier thread, you will outline your gimp pattern so that you can follow the gimp pattern through. And here is the salt mine lace, Sonobaska lace, and that's an example of it, and it's in the Prešov region. We also have this Katarina. Now, I put Katarina in here because when I went to school in Bratislava, I was going into the old town, and I walked into this little studio, and there was this fabulous bobbin lace on the walls, full size dancers, a woman and a man. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I took photographs of this, and then I was researching and I just found her again. And she is just amazing because here's what you can do with bobbin lace. She combines bobbin lace with other types of material, with paintings, with fiber, but she makes her bobbin lace first, and then she designs around the bobbin lace and creates these fabulous designs, including jewelry and including these beautiful scapes. Totally imaginative, totally out of the box of what you would think about using lace for. And here's the village of Spindle, which is one of the villages where the German miners came in. It used to be a mining town. And they have wonderful lace being made here. And it is now a little tourist town. And when the mines failed and when they closed, the lace industry in that town kept these families going. Now, it's a very small town now, but they still do the bobbin lace. And they still are talking to people and they get excited to talk to people about their lace and their history. And this is one of the women that is still doing the lace. And she likes to do it outside so that she can talk to people as they go by. Oh, went backwards. And here's some antique lace that I found online that they're selling out there. But this was a beautiful lace. And it's a combination of embroidery, of open work, cut work, and bobbin lace. And most people think of the Slovak bobbin lace as the tape lace. That's not how it originated. Tape lace was developed because Slovak women wanted their lace to look more like their embroidery. So they developed the tape lace in their villages based on what colors they used in their embroidery and what it looked like. So it developed a little bit differently. And with bobbin lace, depending on where you come from, your lace is distinct to that area because there's Bucks Point lace. You can recognize it is coming from Bucks County in England. You have the Bruges flower lace. It can be recognized very easily there. So you can recognize the different laces based on what countries it's from, what villages it's from. And if you're really good, you can tell which lace maker made it just by their specific technique. But they're all using the same cross twist method. Now, here's the example of the colorful bobbin lace that can be made in different regions in the country. And this is what we all do. We all, well, not all of us, but there's some of us that go out and we demonstrate at different festivals. And this is the reason. You take your lace pillow and you get somebody to sit down and get to try it. And they get to see what it's like to make the lace. So we all, my group that I belong to, we go out and demonstrate. And I also go out to demonstrate at the different festivals in the area. And that's what these people are doing at the Mayava Festival. And I love this when I saw it. Who knew that bobbin lace can make such a beautiful accent for your clothing? So I saw this online and I thought it would be a nice example of what you can do with bobbin lace now. And the use of all these fibers is different. Okay, so this doesn't look like what we're used to, but I included this so that everyone would understand that when lace came in here, when this fiber was being made, when the linen's being made, when the spinning is being done, it wasn't being done only for them. They did have to do it for themselves, but they also had to do it so that they could make clothes or make the items so that the wealthy would put it on their clothing. So these are some examples of the fashion plates that were out in that area. It's not what you expected, is it? So that's what the villagers were doing. They were making an income so that the wealthy could decorate their clothing. And here are some more of the clothing that you can see. And you got embroidery on it, not so much the lace on these. And then you have the croy. So here's what we're doing. We're making our hope chest. Look at the embroidery. Look at the lace on her skirt. Look at the embroidery on her sleeves. It's so fancy. And this is their imagination, or these are patterns that are handed down by their families. We have another one. Every single one of them is different. Their skirts are different. Their sleeves are different, but they're very much embroidered. Look at the baby cap. And that's for a baby. And look how highly decorated it was. So this is where their hard work comes in. and they start creating beauty for themselves in their clothing that they use for their weddings or for going to church or special occasions. And look at the vest and the jacket on the costume from the Lemkovna region. So they're making themselves a beautiful life to live. And I'm just going to go through these not too quickly, but so that you can see the embroideries and the fabric. You know, the shirts are made out of linen, the skirts are made out of linen. Some things are made out of wool, but mostly worn in the wintertime and for the colder weather. This is from Chichmani, and it's very highly decorative, and there's bobbin lace on the bottom of there. And that comes to the end of my presentation for the fiber arts, but I wanted to talk about Sigrid Piroch. She was my master spinner and weaver, and I was asked by a member of the Slavic department at the University of Pittsburgh, and this took me on this track down this way. And I'm sorry, I'm going over my hour here, but Sigrid was introduced to me through the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts after the Slavic department asked me if I would apply for a grant to study with Sigrid for 2 years. And this is how I started learning how to spin and weave in the Slovak Rusyn method. So this is me at a younger age when I'm first starting out at Sigrid's house, totally confused, not sure what I'm doing, but this is the baby wolf. And as you see, I have 4 harnesses. And this is her at my house, showing me how to read a pattern and do the drafting. And the piece on the right is the piece that I have on my loom right now. Now I only have 2 harnesses hooked up because I am using a pickup to put those patterns of the flowers and the geometric patterns in there. And this is Sophie Dorothy hiding in the background there. I wish I had a better picture of her. She's since passed. She's a Romanian woman, and Sigrid took me to her because she's the one that taught me how to spin with a hand spindle. And here she is showing me how they used to ply their wool. They didn't have a spinning wheel. There's a hook on the ceiling. I have 3 of my hand spindles in that bucket on the floor, and I have a large hand spindle that I am swinging back and forth to ply my thread, and it works. Now, as part of the Pennsylvania Heritage and Grant Program, I volunteer to go around and demonstrate the art of spinning and weaving and lace making. So in this picture, you see Katie Mahaly, and she is spinning different than I do. I hold my spindle in between my fingers. She holds it in her fist and she twists it, and she is fast. She does a beautiful job spinning, and she is very, very quick. In the other picture, you see Mary Kay Lemek, who is a friend of mine, who is a member of the Bobbin Lace group, but she went with me here because it was supposed to be a big crowd, and we wanted to demonstrate all 3 things, and that's my loom sitting down there on the right. This is my friend Davy Wong and myself up at the University of Pittsburgh at the Slavic Festival. And Davy Wong is also in my lace group, and she is a master, as far as I'm concerned. She is having her original decorative pieces in galleries throughout Pittsburgh, and she is a brilliant lace maker. But she also helps me when I need help at different demos. This is down in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and I have images up on the wall, and I do have a slide of those. My lace group were kind enough, they sent me pictures of all their lace so that I could show people what you could do with the lace. And here's a cookie pillow up in the right that I'm up at the University of Pittsburgh. I also have my little roller pillow, and I have a display that had a video show at one point looking at different croy and lace make. This is me at the Slovak Embassy 2 different times, and I'm very red-faced the first time. This was the first time I went down to the Slovak Embassy, and I didn't realize how many people would come. And I was telling Helen that the first time I went there, I was overwhelmed because over 4,000 people came through. I wasn't quite prepared for that. The second time I was more prepared, and that's the picture on the right. Now here are pictures of two of my lace pillows with lace in progress. One's a roller pillow, one's a flat pillow. And Helen said somebody asked to see pictures of my lace. So this is what I'm doing. This is my little niece, Sarah. I made the christening gown, and I think there's 7 different laces on there. I don't have a picture of all the laces that are on there, but I have a few. This little flower is the front. And then there's the full length dress that I took several years ago. But you can see that I did a lace that you could put the ribbon through. And I did a lace that had 2 sides that you could sew in so that I can insert it at the bottom. And I also did another lace that was an edging, but you can also put it through there. But there's 2 other laces that you cannot see on the dress. And the underskirt is what is showing on the bottom left hand. I bought a decorative embroidered piece to add to the fabric because I couldn't do the open work. Now here's some pieces of my lace. I did a lace Honiton flower on the left, and that's a piece of Bedfordshire style lace on the right. Here are some edgings that I did and a corner segment that is going to be sewn onto a piece of fabric. Here are some other edgings. Now, these all came out of the Polichkovani books that I had. So this is a torchon style lace, but it came from a couple of the books that I picked up when I was in Slovakia. And the 2 pieces are bucks. The one that looks like it has a heart and the one with all the honeycomb. And the one on the top is also torchon. Here's a garter that I made, and I didn't find one. I made a second garter, but I didn't have a photograph of it. And here are some buck's point edgings that I did. And I also did a butterfly and a cross. The cross is Bedfordshire. The butterfly is a combination of a couple laces. It was the first time I was doing sewings. That was a little bit of a challenge. So then we come down to my family, and I was talking to my cousin, Jano Belichak, and he said, hey, my mom and my aunts do that. So he sent me pictures, and I love it. So these are my cousin Jano's mother and her 2 sisters, Mrs. Tremko, Mrs. Belichak, Mrs. Taringa. And that's the loom that they are making their rugs on. And I have a red and white fabric that I have here, and he looked at it and he said, hey, that looks like our wedding scarves. I'm like, well, my aunt brought it back from when she visited the family, and guess what? These are the people that made it. And there's the rug he has that his mom made him, which I think is beautiful with the color choices. I love it. I got to try to make something like that. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm just going to make some little announcements. My final demonstration this year will be down in Uniontown at their Rusyn Festival on October 30th. And there's the location if anybody's interested in joining us down there. And I do demonstrations throughout the year at the University of Pittsburgh and also the National Sovox Museum here. The National Sovox Society Museum is located in McMurray. It's a small museum, but they have a beautiful display of Croy, some other artifacts, and the large wooden structure that used to be up in Mercer, PA, that is now located at this museum. I also want to mention the Five Rivers Bobbin Lacemakers. They're the group I've belonged to for over 30 some years. These are examples of the lace they make, but we also have some teachers in the group. One lives out in Johnstown. We have a couple here in Pittsburgh, and their email address is there, but you can see the beautiful lace they make. And if you notice on this one, the second one down, that is a collar sticking up. This is made by Davy Wong, and if you open it up, it's the skyline of Pittsburgh, and she designed that herself, but she's designed a lot of other pieces as well. We also have another lace group in Pittsburgh, and it's the Pittsburgh Lace Group. This is their information. They were joined. They do the same as the Five Rivers do, where we purpose is to have fun, but we're also out there to spread the word about bobbin lace and to socialize and everything else, because that's what happens when you do lace or weaving. It acts as a social function for these groups, especially in Eastern Europe, when, you know, in the villages, all of these things were social functions. When they would go and do in the wintertime, you wouldn't stay in your house and do your own work. You'd go to your family's or your friend's house, and a whole group of you would be there. The men would be weaving, the women would be spinning, the kids would be on the floor, maybe peeling apples to preserve or doing preservation stuff. And they'd be singing, there'd be music. So it was a social occasion to make and work on these fibers. So that's what we do. We promote this. And I also go down to Captain William Vickery Mansion. This is right down the road from me, about 7 miles down in Freedom. This is a living history museum. It's also the center for the Beaver County Historical Site. They have a floor with all these looms in it, and they are nice enough to every once in a while, because I cannot make rugs on my loom. It's not heavy enough. So the rug on the bottom is the one I last made down there. It's a teaching school too. They have windows through time for the kids, where they pick a period in century where they will dress the kids up in those clothes, teach them how to cook those foods, show them how to hand sew things. And they also have a whole bunch of different events and activities throughout the year. And that is the end of my talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. That was fascinating. And we have a few questions in the chat. Let me just go to the beginning.
Oops. Can't get rid of it.
Okay, where do you demonstrate? Well, you mentioned that at the end of your presentation.
Well, I'll answer that a little bit more.
Okay.
I demonstrate right now because I was watching my dad for several years, so I was out of the demonstration area. We demonstrate, or I demonstrate, a lot of Eastern European festivals, but I also demonstrate at different historical sites and museums with my group. And my group just was up at Somerset County at their festival out in Johnstown, PA. So it all depends on who invites us and what the purpose of the event is. And usually it's voluntary. Sometimes they give us stipends if it's a long distance to drive, but if it's locally, we just go and we have loads of fun.
Okay. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can see everybody's face?
Oh, sure. I have to. Oops, sorry. Did that stop it?
No, it's up in the top.
There we go. I found it.
Okay,
there we go.
great. Okay.
Sorry about that.
And then there's some concise information about the Wallachian culture. There's a link in the chat. Is bobbin lace typically historical Carpatho-Rusyn and or Slovak?
Every village had their own form of it. If you notice, there were 17. I had the one side that showed the 17 areas that did bobbin lace. Not every village throughout the Czechoslovak Republic does bobbin lace. It was specific usually to the mining regions or to areas where it migrated into.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what they use to dye the threads?
I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that it was usually fiber-based. They, if you were down in the villages, you had a lot of florals and plant life to choose from that they used to extract their colors from. If you're up in the mountains, you have a little bit of more difficulty. So it ends up being a little bit more of bark and berries and things that you can scrounge out of the mountain areas. So it depended on where you lived, whether you lived in the valleys or whether you lived up in the mountains, whatever plant or vegetation or foliage that you had is what you used. And it was all through experimentation. And of course, it was handed down to you from your parents. So this experimentation happened over centuries. And by the time our age would be there, they would have the knowledge of their parents. So they would know how to extract it. Like you can take a simple onion skin, and depending on the type of onion, you can come up with 5 different colors just from an onion skin. So you can play with that. You can try that with your, how you buy these chemical dyes to dye your eggs, or these, dyes that you can do that. Just take your yellow onion and save the skins, boil it in a pot of water with a little bit of vinegar, and throw your raw eggs in there and boil the eggs. You'll get a color on your egg, and you don't have to worry about eating them because it's a natural dye from the onion skins. And you can look that up online if you need proportions on the mordant to the onion skin.
Wow, that's cool. Sue Meissner says she has grown flax for 10 years and finishing up a master's in hand spinning. Her thesis is spinning flax for bobbin lace. She says, you can contact me if you want.
Okay.
That's interesting.
I'd like to. Yeah, the one thing, and I'm sure Sue knows that, is that the flax plants that used to exist are almost non-existent now. There used to be flax fibers that were so fine that you could barely see them. Those plants have disappeared through lack of cultivation, but also, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Sue probably knows this, during World War II, a lot of the flax fields in Europe were wiped out, and a lot of them didn't recover. And one of those is the flax production in Slovakia. Right now, the only flax production that's being done on a large scale is industrial flax production for the linseed. Most of the other stuff is imported, but it's wonderful to see now that there are artisans out there that are growing their own flax and harvesting their flax, but it's not the same as when bobbin lace first started. But I'll definitely have to get Sue's contact information because I'd love to hear what she's doing.
Okay, Sue, can you put it in the chat for Mary? Okay, what kind of, let's see, any quick info about knitting in the history of fiber in Slovakia?
I don't know a lot about it, but they did have the wool, and like knitting anywhere else, they used the long metal thin double pointed needles. I haven't done a lot of research on it, but of course I was taught to knit. So somebody in my family knew how to knit and taught my mom, who taught me. And but I haven't done the history on it, but that's something that I can do down the line. But I do know that they did use the double pointed needles, and they did spin their own wool to do the knitting.
Okay. What kind of interest in these crafts is there among amateur needleworkers in Slovakia? Is there a future there for these crafts among the younger people?
I think there is, because you're seeing it more and more at these different festivals, but you also see young artisans taking a traditional craft and making it into something modern that they can use in their everyday life. So it's not just being designated to croy anymore. It's actually being utilized in art forms and more into what the younger generation would like. So you are seeing more of it. I don't know if it's expanded too much. I haven't been able to visit Slovakia for a while, but I'm hoping to get there within the next couple of years now and see what's new.
Okay, where does tatting fit into this, or does it? And how do you tell the difference?
Okay, so bobbin lace is made with multiple threads. You can have as few as 4 threads up to several hundred threads. So you're using multiple threads, and you're crossing and weaving your threads. So you're crossing and twisting your threads, so it's more like weaving. And you're also putting the little picots in by making loops over pins and twisting the threads. With tatting, you're using a single shuttle and you're throwing it through a loop and you're making knots. As far as I have not seen it in the Rusyn culture and or Eastern Europe culture that I've been exposed to. Does that mean they're not doing it? No, I just have not come across it. It's not something that I have seen in the Croy or anywhere else. And it's very distinct. You know, when you look at bobbin lace, you can see that it's woven. And when you look at tatting, you can see that it's been looped and knotted. So you can tell the difference. And I just haven't seen tatting in the croy or the fibers that I've seen, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
Mhm. That's interesting. My mother used to do tatting,
Mhm.
and she was, of course, Slovak. And yeah, it's not very common, but I'm sure that there's some places in Slovakia that do tatting as well. You mentioned lace makers coming from either Latvia or Estonia. Were their lace traditions very different?
I have not researched them. They are going to be the same techniques, but that's what I was trying to explain. Whether you come from one village or you could be one village and there's another village 10 miles down the road, and the technique's the same. The crossing and twisting of the threads are the same, but the patterns that you create are going to be unique to your village. And if you go to that village and you look it up, you can see what their patterns are like and their colors too. So I just saw somebody pop up and said that tatting was done in Hungary. Thank you.
Hungary.
It popped up real quick, so I didn't get to see the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Well,
tatting, so it's probably out there somewhere.
As I scroll down, I'll see it.
Okay.
Okay, the next question is kind of the same, or sort of the same. Was embroidery also reflective of specific areas? And
absolutely.
How can I research my Bubba's tablecloth design? I have no idea where she was from.
Okay, so there you can check with the Carpatho-Rusyn Society. They have a genealogical page. They have some brilliant people there that recognize a lot of things, and they know what things look like for different villages, so they might be able to help you. But the way I would start, if you have your mother's name and birth date, go get a birth certificate and then find out who her parents were, and then go get their birth certificates and find out who they are. And eventually you're going to find out where they immigrated to this country from and find the town that they came from, which is how I am doing it. Now, I was lucky enough that my grandparents and great grandparents were alive. However, I don't know where my great grandmother's family came from, just outside of Mukachevo. But the further I get, I keep finding little trails that lead me there. So eventually I'll find it. So my recommendation would be get your mother's birth certificate, find out who her parents were, find their birth certificates, and follow it back.
That's called genealogy.
Yes, exactly.
And that's my area of expertise.
So there, you can give them some hints.
Yes. Okay, and here my Hungarian grandmother did tatting. She was ethnic Hungarian whose family lived near Rosnava, Slovakia. Okay.
So there we go.
Yes. And Helen says, a couple of Estonian knitted lace books were published in recent years. Their lace is often involves using baubles scattered decoratively across the fabric in regular patterns. Okay, yes, so Helen knows. Wow. And that's the end of my questions in the chat. If anyone has any questions that they would like to unmute and ask Mary, you can do that now.
Hi, this is Susan Ripka.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi.
I can.
Yes, I had also heard that bobbin lace has very ancient origins in Asia and also Crete. So it isn't just Europe. It was truly a worldly thing. They weren't sophisticated, but they were bobbin lace.
That's why I didn't mention it, Sue, because I've just started to research that. And I think what you're talking about is they used to do what we call a plait, where they would take 4 pairs of threads and plait them. And that basically is the basis and the starting of bobbin lace.
I see. Okay.
That's what I'm thinking is happening. I just started to do that research because they honestly don't know exactly where it started. But the foundation of bobbin lace are those plattings that people were doing.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad somebody just mentioned Helene Sensibo. I know Helene, and yes, Helene Sensibo might be able to help you identify your fabric. She's out in New York, and
No,
she wrote.
she moved to Florida.
Oh, she moved to Florida, but I didn't know. Oh my goodness.
Yes.
All right, so Helene's now down in Florida. I don't have her contact information now then, but she wrote a book, and so she has a book out there on the croy and other things.
Yes, she may be able to help Anna figure out what where her lace came from. Let's see, there was something else in the chat. What is plaiting of lace?
When you plait, let me see if I can go to my my lace pictures real quick. When you plait, just like you plait your hair, you're making like a braid. And I have a picture of, in one of my laces, I think I had some plaiting. Let me look real quick. But anyway, what you're basically doing is taking 4 pairs of bobbins and you're literally making a braid out of the bobbins. And I'm going to share my slide. Let me see.
Okay.
Can I share this?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, I have it up and I'm not seeing the share bobbin. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if you're looking here, up in the upper hand corner, you will see these little plaits. Those were done with 4 pairs or, 4 threads. And I plaited them together and I made little picots along them. You also see a plait over here that's coming out from the foot side coming in. You see plaits on this lace, and that's just twisting those threads so they braid. Does that help?
I thought it was helpful.
Okay.
That looks so complicated. Is that hard to do, to make bobbin lace?
When I first saw this, I actually saw it out at Robin Hill, and a young woman was demonstrating it. And I'm actually not a lace fan, but I love it. And it's such a weird thing to say, but I was fascinated by the process. And when I looked at it from this side of the pillow, it was like, how in the world is she doing that? So she became my first teacher, and her name was Sandy DeWitt. And I went to her house with a small group of 5 or 6 people, and she showed me the basics, and it wasn't that bad. Now, more of the complicated, yes, I struggle on some of the more complicated things, but making bobbin lace, the basics aren't hard to learn. It's a very methodical, logical process. And if you start right with a good teacher, you won't have any problems. Or if you're good learning out of books, there's several good books out there that you can learn from. And there's one supplier I know in New York, Holly Van Skyver. She's very good at telling you what you need and helping you find the products, but you may have a local vendor for products for bobbins. Now there's a difference in the bobbins too. I learned using East Midlands style bobbins. East Midlands is an area of Great Britain that developed these very decorative bobbins that you saw in my lace pillow. These are not traditional to Eastern Europe. A solid wood bobbin that has a bulbous area to add tension, a weight to the bottom. Whereas with the East Midlands, you have glass beads to add the weight back because you're carving them, you're making them lightweight. You need that tension on your threads. So, but they're called continental style bobbins, are what the most of Eastern Europe used. All right, I just saw a question from Karen about warping. I'm going to go down to one of my loom pictures so that I can show you. Bear with me one second while I find it. Okay, I'm going to go down. There it is. Okay, so when you weave, you have what's called a warp and a weft thread. So if you look on the loom to the left, the threads that are going from front or the back to the front of the loom are the warp threads. So if you look at this picture in the middle, this is the front of the loom. And it goes, I don't know, whoops, I just moved my picture. If you go from the front to the back, that is the warp threads. The weft threads are the ones that you're throwing left and right to actually create the fabric.
And that's weaving.
Yep, that's basic weaving.
Mhm. Okay, anyone else have any questions for Mary? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mary. This was a fascinating presentation. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else has too. And
Yes, thank you so much.
I'm just going to say that I hope everyone has a pleasant afternoon. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Mary.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you for asking me. And everybody else out there, thank you for your wonderful questions. And I appreciate you all joining. Sorry, I went over the time frame I was supposed to.
That's okay. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Great job, Mary.
That's my brother. Thank you, John.
Good job, Mary.
Thank you very much.